Very excited today to be able to talk to our next guest, the author of several books, a couple of them related to James Bond. Outside of that, a writer who has appeared in many publications, including the Huffington Post, Los Angeles Times, even Empire Magazine, and a big fan of many things pop culture related, but this is a James Bond podcast. We're talking about his James Bond books. His most recent book is called The Lost Adventures of James Bond, which is a fantastic book going into a variety of lost Bond stories, everything from a couple of Timothy Dalton films that we could have had, a lot of James Bond comics, there's even a James Bond ride, and even a James Bond play, which could have happened on Broadway potentially one day. I'm so excited to learn more about these, the process of writing the book, and everything else in between. It's a pleasure to welcome to 007, Mark Edlitz. Mark, first of all, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
I am very thrilled to be here. Thank you.
It's exciting, obviously, for you as a Bond fan to sit down and think about things I'm sure that you can write about, all these different books and everything else. Your first book, The Many Lives of James Bond, was a great success. And then you came to this book, The Lost Adventures of James Bond. Was this something that you've always wondered about? You've sat on, you're like most Bond fans, and think, like, what would have happened if Dalton did a third film, a fourth film, and thought, well, I'm going to write a book on this and find out what I can about it?
Let me definitely answer that, but let me go back a tiny bit, if I may. So I wrote a book called How to Be a Superhero, which was a book of interviews with actors who've played superheroes over the last 7 decades. So it's like Adam West on Batman, Lou Ferrigno as a Hulk, sort of the not the ones you suspect, not the superheroes you suspect, but beloved ones. And I snuck James Bond into that book, even though James Bond is not a superhero. And I realized that I really wanted to write a book on James Bond. And I felt like I had some sort of James Bond book in me. I'm a big fan of James Bond podcasts and books and magazines. So I really try to absorb it. And for the first book, The Many Lives of James Bond, I didn't have a theme necessarily. So I reached out and researched or interviewed anybody affiliated with James Bond who I thought it would be interesting. And when I write a chapter at a time, meaning I do set out to write a book, but I don't know how to write a full book. I just go, I'm going to concentrate on this chapter. When this chapter is done, I'll write the next one. And so, of course, you go back and forth and check your work and give it a little distance and revisit. Anyway, when I finished the manuscript for that first book, Many Lives of James Bond, it was about 160,000 words. My publisher wanted about 80,000 words.
Wow.
Although they did give me 100,000 in the end. And so
good compromise.
Yeah, exactly. So I needed some sort of organizing principle for the first book. And that became artists talking about their creative process in interpreting James Bond. How do you interpret James Bond when you're making a Bond movie, writing a novel, creating a Bond video game, etc., or writing a Bond comic? And that also became interviews with actors who played James Bond in any medium. So that was films, radio, video games, television. And we could get all of that, but this is sort of broad strokes. And anything that wasn't that had to go. And it turned out anything that wasn't that were these unpublished, unmade, unfinished, or forgotten Bond stories. And and so that was about 60,000 words. And so that became the genesis of the second book. But of course, I kept on writing, and that book ultimately became even longer than the first.
It's a great read for a book that is over 400 pages long. I just mentioned to this off air. I couldn't put it down, Mark. And this is the thing. It's ongoing joke on this show is that I can't read, but it's I could read and I didn't want to stop reading because it really was there. So, I mean, did you find with the process of this, did you have a word limit, or were you able to say to your publisher, like, hey guys, like this one could be longer because there's more interesting stories, so can we have sort of a bit extra here to be able to write with?
Well, my publisher was kind enough to offer me an opportunity to go again with them. This time I elected to self-publish as an experiment. So I didn't have any restrictions at all other than what I thought the book should be.
It's fascinating to think the publicity around this book, of course, has a lot been around the Lost Dalton films, which we'll talk about now, but there's so many other interesting, fascinating things about what you've uncovered. But it really is kind of one of those big what-if scenarios in the James Bond universe. Is what would a Timothy Dalton third film be like, potentially a fourth film that you discussed, because of all the issues we had between License to Kill and what ultimately turned out to GoldenEye. But when you were writing The Many Lives of James Bond, was this some of the things that you were uncovering, that extra work? I mean, has it kind of been a question to you that really the stuff you'd uncovered already, you thought, well, okay, this is that what-if scenario that people want to do, so let's explore that as well?
Yeah, good question. I've always been my favorite period of James Bond lore, or my biggest James Bond unsung answer. What is the big question for me is, what would have Timothy Dalton's third film have been like? And that's always been a subject of great fascination to me and other Bond fans, of course. I've always wanted to know, because I love Living Daylights. To me, yeah. It's a great Bond film that was indicative of the Bond films that they were making at the time. To me, it's classic Bond. It fits in with all the previous Bond films. License to Kill was obviously an attempt to do something different. It's, we say grittier, we say more violent, we say more realistic, more, et cetera. Some say closer to Fleming, but they're so different. And his performances are slightly different in each. I love his performance in Living Daylights because it's all the colors that you want to see in Bond. In addition to ruthless, he's also romantic, charming, light, and I think funny. And because of the nature of the revenge aspect of License to Kill, there's a little bit more anger. So the performance is tailored to fit the given circumstances of the script. But I always wondered, what would have that third film been? Would it have been more like License to Kill? Would it have been more like Daylights? Or would it have been something completely different? And so I just kept on researching and trying to find out a possible answer. And the book offers a few unmade Dalton stories, about 4 in total. After License to Kill, a writer by the name of Alphonse Ruggiero was hired to write the next Bond film. Alphonse, the one thing that when you read about Alphonse Ruggiero in Bond 17 is they always say he was Miami Vice, and there was speculation that because Miami Vice, which is a TV show about cops in Miami frequently taking down drug dealers, there was a thought that his version of Bond was going to be drug dealer related. And the reason that script did not go forward is because there's plenty of drug dealing stories in License to Kill. But that's not the case at all. They really hired him because he worked on another show called Wise Guy, which was a early Sopranos type show, mm-hmm. which was serialized as opposed to one-off stories, which were more common at the time in television. Even the villains were as interesting as the good guys, and he was a quick writer. And so it was sort of all of those things brought together that made them hire him. And tracking him down was, I don't remember how long it took, but it took about a year of first just tracking him down. And then once tracking him down, And after he agreed to be interviewed, setting up a time for that interview, that whole process was easily a year. And when I called him, we eventually said, I'll speak to you on this time on this day. And when I called him and he picked up, the first thing he said, "Are you surprised that I answered?" Which was his very good natured way of saying, "Yeah, I know. I guess this is taking a bit of time." But he really answered all, or I say most of my Bond 17 questions. And he wrote he talks about two things in the interview. One, he talks about the process of physically writing the script with Michael Wilson. Their creative process of getting together, and Michael Wilson would bake bread for the two of them.
Yeah.
And go on walks and talk. And I just loved how that sort of day-to-day insight into their writing process. And then the other thing he did is he answered a lot of my questions about what they were going for. And I think that the biggest misconception about Bond 17 is that it was going to be Bond versus the Terminator. So what that means is that there was a character. The rumor about Bond 17 is that there's a fully robotic character like the Terminator and that's sort of the focus of the film. And it's true that there is a character who has robotic features, but maybe they're just
fembot, basically.
A fembot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. But it's not explicitly spelled out if that character is enhanced or a complete android or what. And I think they were just going to keep it. I don't think they were ever going to tell the audience. They were going to make it one of those fun little Bond mysteries, like in Live and Let Die with Jeffrey Holder's character. He seems to die more than once.
Yeah, exactly.
And they never really explained that. I mean, you get it from the context of the story that maybe there's a little bit of mystical magic that keeps him alive. But do they ever really spell it out? No, they just, it's one of those things that it's a fun little mystery. And I think that this character would have been a fun little mystery. Now, it's also important to remember that this character was just one of many, many different elements in the script, and it wasn't really focused on her. But I think they really wrote a fantastic, serious techno thriller. And I'm really sorry that one didn't come to pass.
It's a great way of putting it that way because, on paper, when somebody says to you, "Oh my God, this is what they were planning to do," it sounds batshit crazy, and you're thinking like, "Oh my God, Bond would have jumped the shark." But the way I like to look at it is we recently did our big recap of No Time to Die. And if you kind of put some of the things on paper for that without seeing the movie, you would also probably think it's crazy. Bond attends Blofeld's birthday party, and there's an eyeball going around the place, which Blofeld is trapping him to kill him with gas that will only kill him and his DNA, while robotic microbots will go in his blood and help kill. I mean, like, all of that sounds batshit crazy if you see it without context. So this is definitely one of those things where it kind of feels that way. Just when you track the guy down, and as you said, it's such a process. I mean, is that the most satisfying interview that you can do in a book like this? Because I know what it's like when you're trying to track people down and after a while you finally get them on. It's a great feeling. So for you, a year's worth of tracking him down and getting him to agree to a time and get the information you got, that must be very satisfying.
Yeah, that was one of the greats. There's so many wonderful books on Bond. There's so many different wonderful podcasts and magazines that I tried to offer something that a reader wouldn't get elsewhere. That when I do one of these books, whatever I'm working on, I'm trying to offer something that the reader wouldn't necessarily find elsewhere. And I thought with this book, that was one of the things. And in each book, I solved like this mini Bond mystery. I call that a big Bond mystery. Yeah. What would Dalton's third Bond have been like? And we get to his fourth in a second. But in one of the books, here, the Many Lives of James Bond. So Bond has been on radio.
Yeah.
And the first radio show was the first ever adaptation of Bond in any medium other than comics, was a South African broadcast of Moonraker with Bob Holness as James Bond. And I never understood, first of all, I didn't understand, there was no context to that information. And as a very small point, nobody knew what year it took place. You know, there was rumors as 56, 57, 58, 59, but nobody ever really knew. And I was able to track down, I give the reader two things there. One was something which I did not do, but was a generous Bond fan gave me. Brian, who runs a website called the Bondologist blog, conducted a written interview with Bob Holness, who gave his most complete telling of playing James Bond. And he answered all the questions that a fan would want to know. And Brian very generously allowed me to put it in the book. So everything that Bob Holness wanted to say about James Bond is in that book. But the other thing that I did is, and this is small, but it's big for me, is I was able to solve the mystery of what year that took place by, I got the contract, Bob Holness's contract that he signed to play James Bond, and it's got the date of the production, the number of rehearsals, how much he was paid. And I also interviewed his daughter about it, and she filled in all the other details. So I felt like that is something that I was able to offer the reader that they couldn't get anywhere else. And then for this other book, the second one, The Lost Adventures of James Bond, there's another Bond mystery. And it's who wrote the children's book, 003 and a half. What's the correct full title?
Yeah, there was the sort of like the precursor, like a James Bond Jr. style 003 and a half from the 50s
exactly.
or the 60s, wasn't it? Yeah.
And the name on the book is R.D. Mascot. But what's funny about that, because it's a pseudonym, is that usually when you write a pseudonym or use a pseudonym, you don't tell people you're using a pseudonym. But when you open the book, it says R.D. Mascot is a pseudonym for a well-known British author or something like that. So you're like, why did you use the pseudonym? And why did you reveal that you've used the pseudonym? So I was able to track down. And so for years, nobody knew who wrote the book. It's always been speculation. A lot of people thought it was Roald Dahl, the children's author who also wrote the screenplay You Only Live Twice. But it's not. And I was able to track down and find out the true identity of that Bond writer. And so that was fun to solve that Bond mystery.
You're James Bond yourself, Mark, basically. You're just you're going around finding all this information. One thing I just wanted to quickly touch on, which you revealed sort of in, the plot of I think it was Dalton's Bond 17 of Bond's third film. Bond was meant to go to Canada. He was meant to go to Vancouver. And now Colin's obviously not with us today, and we often have an ongoing thing on this show about where will Bond go to first, Australia or Canada, two places he's never been. I had to point this out that Bond was meant to go to Canada finally in Bond 17 and they cancelled it. So, I mean, is it surprising that you kind of, when you read these sort of plot treatments and things like that, where they were going to go to places that Bond hasn't been before, and obviously some things you touch on that you could argue they've used in future Bond films from that point on. When you look at something like a location, all jokes aside, are you surprised that they maybe didn't use that? Like, let's go to Vancouver, let's go to Canada or a random place, because it's always about the exotic locations, and maybe Canada's not too exotic for a Bond universe.
Yeah, no, you're right that sometimes the locations drive the plot, where they'll do a location scout and they say, "Oh, we have access or the ability to be at this wonderful, unique location. Let's come up with a plot or a reason that Bond's there." Because, and you even see it with the chase sequences. I mean, there's not necessarily a good reason for Bond to drive a car versus a motorcycle versus an airplane. He's being chased. So what are you going to put him in? Sometimes it's, what are you going to put him in a different vehicle than he's been in? And in one of the books, I make a list of all the vehicles that James Bond has driven, because his ability to to know all these different skills of piloting and driving and flying is pretty remarkable. And they actually this is off topic, but the writer of the Mission Impossible films has learned that, and now he says, instead of trying to find a location that matches my script, let's show me a cool location and I'll write the story around it.
Interesting. Yeah, it's all like that. I guess times have changed in the fact that obviously when you're watching a Bond film in the 60s, people back then are not able to turn on TV and see Jamaica and the Bahamas and Japan. You know, this was a unique thing. Whereas nowadays, we're obviously very spoilt for choice and people can easily travel to these places unlike they could back then. So it's a little bit different. But I mean, again, on No Time to Die, we recently talked about how the locations in that were absolutely stunning, you know, to see.
Oh, I completely agree with you.
Norway, returning to Jamaica, you know, it's things like that. But we'll get to Canada one day, surely, and maybe Australia. Who knows? The thing that I found really interesting about Dalton's Lost Films is, yeah, all the talk can be about sort of some of the more crazier things, you know, the robots, artificial intelligence, cowboys, things like that. But I think what really struck me in what would have made it interesting is that the characters sounded really developed and sounded really interesting, like the Bond girls, the villains, everything along those lines. And it just, I don't know if that comes down to any film treatment when it's just being put on paper, when it's been scripted, is that's what they're going to sound like, and ultimately it's going to come differently on screen. But it honestly sounded like we've missed out on some really good characters. Did you feel that kind of when you were discovering the information about it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on both counts. Whenever you read an outline or a treatment, they're usually dreadful. I mean, because they're not meant to be read as enjoyment. They're meant as a tool, often to communicate to other people in the creative party, often people who are paying for the film, or who are going to say go from treatment to script. So they're not meant for that purpose. They're not meant to draw you in necessarily, only other than to say draw you in enough to get approved to go to the next level, which is a screenplay. But with all that in mind, so in general, these things are dry. I think these really did show, I mean, just terrific writing. And I think that they did draw these characters and pulled you in. So absolutely, yeah.
And it's also a case of the tone of the films. Like, it's sort of, there was a line there where it was almost sounding like you were kind of going a bit more comedic, and Dalton sort of, you know, see how we would have done that. But then there was sort of that whole area about Dalton portraying a Bond who is over it. He's older. You know, he's the too old for this shit kind of mantra from the late 80s, which it's fascinating because so many people talk about, I know Colin, for example, not the biggest Dalton fan, but he's always said he would have loved to have seen a third Dalton film to see where he would have lied with that. So, I mean, how do you think that would have lived up to things, even if he had just done 17, if, you know, 18 didn't work out? How would have that worked in terms of his betrayal?
So what you're for the listeners, what you're referring to is the second iteration of Dalton's third Bond film. So, which is to say that after they had this Alfonso Ruggiero, Michael Wilson script, Alphonse said that they made that into a screenplay, but then after that, two other writers came on and took some of the same ideas that were in that previous script or outline, and then turned it into what I think is a whole other new thing. And in this version, it's an action comedy. It's not a sophisticated thriller like the other version. It's an action comedy. And in this action comedy, with as much emphasis on the comedy as action, Bond is feeling like he's lost his mojo. And so the whole movie is about him getting his mojo back. And often Bond is plagued by self-doubt, and he says, I'm not going to be able to do this. And when he does something spectacular, he turns to one of the characters and says, "Oh my gosh, did you see this? I jumped from the plane, I landed in the pool. It's spectacular." But it's all treated with humor. And there's this one sequence where Bond is being chased by the bad guys at a rodeo, So he dresses up as a cowboy, or and seeing Dalton in a cowboy outfit, it might sound terrible, but it's kind of wonderful. This wonderful artist, Pat.
Yeah.
Because when you have a book, people always, they want images. You can't show an image for a film that was never shot. So Pat drew these images from the film that could have been, including Dalton in a cowboy hat and outfit, which is from
it looks fantastic. It really does kind of visualize it. I think it would have been so fascinating because we've talked a lot about Dalton's other work outside of Bond, and that he's kind of really found a niche post-Bond as almost a comedic actor. We did a recap on Beautician and the Beast. We had the director on, Ken Kwapis, and kind of talked to him a lot about how, did you kind of untap this comedic element to Dalton that maybe he hadn't seen before, and he hadn't really thought about it that way. So it would have been really unique to see Dalton do a bit more of a comedic Bond. I mean, I'm with you. I think Living Daylights, there's a lot more funny elements to that than people ever give it credit for. But I don't know. I don't know if you've watched much Dalton outside of Bond and seen some of more of his comedic stuff lately. But he's got a good thing for comedy. He's discovered.
Oh, absolutely. When you look at what's
Hot Fuzz.
Hot Fuzz. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's
even
great
the Looney Tunes, Mark, Looney Tunes back in action, Toy Story,
Oh, in the Toy Story he's in, and then in the Penny Dreadful, which is not so funny. Well, it's darkly funny. He's great. Yeah. No, I love Dalton. I mean, he you always talk about an older Bond. He would be great. I think he'd even enjoy playing it more than he did that. And the thing about Dalton is that I think there's a little bit of a misconception about, I hope this is not off topic, but a little bit of a misconception about him. He took the role seriously and he prepared for it seriously. He went back to the books and he treated it as seriously as any other material. The thing he didn't like was, promoting, and that's an important part of the job, but that wasn't his favorite part of the job. Pierce Brosnan says that being James Bond is like being an ambassador to a small country. And I think that's true. And so as important, for better or for worse, it's just as important to go out and spread the word about the film as it is to make the film. But you're also dealing with sort of the same silly questions over and over again. So, anyway.
It is one of those things we've talked a lot about, sort of each of the actors and kind of how they do, I guess, promote or talk about it. I mean, we've always talked about, obviously, Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan kind of seem to be very open about it. George Lazenby, of course, whereas, Daniel Craig kind of, I think now that he's stepped away, probably will, maybe go into the Connery categories and the Dalton categories of talk to me about anything else but Bond. Like, I'm a lot more than Bond when it comes to that. The other sort of angle from a Dalton film, which I never even knew was a potential, was sort of the Living Daylights was very much going to be an origin story. This could have been sort of what we would have had, similar to what we had with Casino Royale, which again, the treatment was fascinating. I mean, was that something that was widely known, or did you kind of discover this essentially?
I don't know. I didn't know so much about it. For all of these things, I didn't know so much about it. And part of the reason I was doing this was to learn. And so so the origin story is so interesting. It's, people say Casino Royale is sort of an origin story. I don't know if I completely buy that. He's just sort of, that's obviously the first book. And in the movie, it's his first mission. But so he's an unformed agent. But I don't know if I would completely classify that as an origin story, in that this other iteration that Richard Maybaum and Michael Wilson wrote together was a pre-007 Bond. It starts off where Bond is not James, which is not 007, and he's sort of a lost soul who's carousing and enjoying life, but you could see that he's also finding it empty. And he gets brought into the Secret Service, and you see him go on a mission with an established agent, and that agent teaches him the ropes, but he also gives him pointed advice that will carry over to Bond's other adventures, about just practical advice, but you could see it forging Bond's character. And that script, as it ended, would have had Bond going to his Dr. No mission. So it would have taken place right before.
Which is, it's interesting to think too, that when I was reading that, is obviously we know Pierce Brosnan was very close to being Bond back around the Living Daylights and everything that happened around that. So it would have been intriguing, because I don't know if you ever watched the Living Daylights and think, well, how would Brosnan be in this role versus Dalton? It would have been interesting to think if there was an origin story, if that maybe was written with Brosnan in mind rather than Dalton, how that would have turned out. Because some of, like, you mentioned the elements about sort of being, I guess, taken under the wing by an older 007. Obviously, we know with GoldenEye, initially that was written with Trevelyan, with Anthony Hopkins in mind, kind of almost like a mentor. So you wonder if, like, they used that element from writing it for Brosnan, kind of turned that into GoldenEye, and then kind of things like that. It's interesting to think about those parallels there.
Yeah. That is fun to think about. And the problem is, as outsiders, is we don't know. So we'll see elements that are recycled. In a couple of these stories, there is a villain who is impotent. And so, but by different writers. So you wonder, I wonder if someone had this idea for it and they suggested it to the writer, and that's where it came from. So it was literally, let's try this. And that's often the case in series where you have an idea for a character that you're like, I want to keep on trying, and it never works. And then sometimes writers come to the same idea at the same time separately.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to allow that to have been a thing too, where, like, sometimes I'll see something in one of these, let's say, unmade stories, and you'll see it later on with Brosnan or even Craig, and you're like, and I wonder, I don't know if anyone really showed any of these writers these other drafts or these other outlines, or even if they wanted to. Sometimes there's reasons that you don't give a writer previous work, because then you are obligated to the first writer. The first writer gets the most protection in the Writers Guild. So it's one of the things that we should always keep in mind when we're thinking about these things, is we're also looking at people's thought processes at one moment in time. So sometimes you write a script or put it down in an outline as a question. Will this work? I don't know. Let's try it out. And so many of these things do work, but we should. I try to be mindful that if we didn't see it down the road, maybe they too thought it didn't work. Maybe this idea of a Bond who's plagued with self-doubt, as is in one of the iterations, is not something that they wanted to explore.
And then maybe Mike Myers discovers things, reads, Fembot, I'll use that in an Austin Powers movie. So, hey, it kind of works along those ways. Obviously, a lot more in this book outside of the Lost Timothy Dalton films, and a couple that I wanted to touch on. I was so fascinated reading all the information you did on James Bond Jr. We've covered the pilot on this show, and it's an interesting journey. But I don't know again if there's really been much written on the history of it. It was so interesting learning about and how seriously it was taken, because it's obviously something often mocked by Bond fans, but like this was a big deal for everybody involved, and Eon and the Broccoli put a lot of effort into this show.
I'm so happy that you took that away from it, and yes, I think that my book has the most comprehensive account of James Bond Jr. For some, perhaps too much. But yeah, they took it really, really seriously. They weren't, I gave it a lot of book space and research, not necessarily because I thought it's good or bad. I don't concern myself with it, whether good or bad, but the book is about intent. And their intent was to make a nuanced cartoon about James Bond's younger days. Now, what came across might not have been that, or wasn't that, but they really put all their effort into this. This was co-written, co-created, I should say, by Michael G. Wilson.
Yeah.
And so so it was great to learn about the process that they went through in writing that and creating that. I speak to the people who wrote the scripts, the people who wrote the spin-off novels. I look at the Bible. So your listeners probably know this. A series Bible, or is sort of the film, is the guide by which other people go by to. It's got character descriptions and it tells about the intent. And so, one of their ideas was to have the James Bond iris open each show. They try to structure it like a mini James Bond movie. They wanted the humor to be sophisticated. They wanted the plots to be sophisticated. They weren't trying to dumb it down. And they put a lot of resources in this. There were video games, there were spin-off books, there were Marvel comics. They threw everything at it.
And the Bible, every person you talk to would talk about this and kind of these guidelines, and even kind of, I guess, having to check sometimes like on what they could and couldn't do. But the thing that really fascinated me was kind of that insight into the world of animation, the fact that there was like 60 odd episodes that they basically write, record, put together all at once. This isn't like a TV show where you're putting episodes together over a certain period of time and you're going along. This is all done at once, and I'm like, wow, these animators, they have got a very busy damn job.
Yeah, no, it's 65 episodes, I think from 90 to 91. And they were all sort of working on top of each other. And so I spoke to, a bunch of the writers, as I mentioned, and I would say, oh, look, you're sort of doing, they would pitch multiple ideas to the same person, thinking, I could do a variation on a theme. But they would, all those ideas would get approved. So if sometimes there were similarities, they weren't necessarily thinking that each idea would get approved. They would, just because they needed so much material all at once, they just said, yes, yes, yes. And off the writers went. But the other thing about that is that all the writers took it they took their job seriously. They realized that they were a part of the James Bond franchise and that they were trying to do it to the best of their ability.
The comic section, again, was very fascinating, because I'll be honest, it's sort of not a medium of James Bond that I've really ever focused too much on, but people are talking about this book with the Timothy Dalton storylines, but I just want to point out to our listeners, if they've not read the book, some of the storylines that were involved in the comics. Bond fights a yeti. There was a Scandinavian comic where Bond basically was connected to Star Wars. He came across the Millennium Falcon, I believe. And there was even one where he was involved with dinosaurs. It sounded very Jurassic Park, that there were being dinosaurs brought back to life. So, fascinating to learn all that sort of stuff. But what did you take away from all your research and interviews about all the different versions of the comics?
So Alan J. Porter, who's the leading authority on James Bond comics, has pointed out that there's been more original Bond stories in comics than there have in all other media together. So it's the largest source of Bond comics, and as such, I felt like it was important to investigate that a little bit. And a lot of the comics are licensed by. Or most of the comics are licensed either by Ian Fleming Publications / Glib Rose. There's all these wonderful licensed James Bond comics, and most of them are English language. There's also a number of them that have been translated from English to other countries, but most of them have started in the English language. But there's so many great Bond comics if you're Spanish speaking. And if you're not, I try to translate the good parts or the most salient parts, a lot of them. And there's this one company called Zigzag, and this great artist by the name of German Gabler, Gabler, who's from Chile. And he wrote these James Bond comics that were both adaptations of all of Ian Fleming's novels and short stories, as well as original ones. And so these are as faithful adaptations as you can get, in one comic book, including the short stories, as I said. So, but he also makes up his own stuff that is perhaps not quite as faithful to Fleming as his other stuff, but it's delightful. There's in one Bond battles a yeti, a Bigfoot type creature. In another one, Bond wears a bumblebee costume,
yes,
and takes flight with a group of other of these crooks who also wear bumblebee costumes.
Yeah.
It's in another one he goes surfing.
Yeah.
And what's
Which
great
is
about
Sean Connery's likeness too, wasn't it?
That's what I was about to say. What's great about these is that it's Sean Connery's likeness through all of these comic books.
Yeah.
So you see Sean Connery in stories that are not normally associated with Connery. For example, it's Sean Connery in Moonraker. It's Sean Connery in The Spy Who Loved Me. And it's The Spy Who Loved Me based on the Fleming novel, not the film. So it's wonderful.
It really was fascinating. I was blown away by some of the ideas that were out there. Did you have a favorite of all the ones that you kind of discovered?
Bond versus a Yeti it's hard to top that.
Yeah. There's a film treatment. We want to see that. Idris Elba in Bond 26 battles a Yeti. I think we'd kind of be excited for that. Some of the other, you did sort of a lot about choose your own adventure style Bond books, which, spoiler alert if you haven't seen No Time to Die, like precursor to some of the stuff that happens in that. But the one that fascinated me about that was R.L. Stine wrote a Bond book, which is something that I don't know if anybody knew. The Goosebumps guy wrote a Bond book.
So there are these, when A View to a Kill came out, there's this company who would do these Find Your Fate books. These Find Your Fate books are similar to, as you're saying, choose your own adventure. If you want Bond to shoot the guy, turn to page 77. If you want him to run away, turn to page 42. And the reader controls Bond's fate. So there's 4 of these. And as you're saying, L. Ron Stein, who I did a very, very quick, a one-sentence interview with him, only because he didn't remember that much. But he wrote one of these, which is incredible. And they come with this incredible artwork by these artists the artwork on it looks like a Roger Moore James Bond movie that you never saw. They're just wonderful. And they're just a weird. They're just not you don't. I didn't expect to find a choose your own adventure style James Bond book. Yeah, and there's 4 of them. 3 of them are adaptations of certain elements of A View to a Kill, meaning that they narrow in on one confined area of the movie. For example, the horse racing. But one is essentially an original story.
Another one that really, again, so much stuff about it that fascinated me in the book, Mark, but was the ride, this kind of ride that existed in the late 90s that you could put you in like a James Bond experience. And again, similar to what I was saying about James Bond Jr., the effort that they put into it. The filming of this sort of film sequence, they got Judi Dench involved, Desmond Llewellyn. They put a lot of effort into this. Why didn't this last? This is something that I would travel to experience. It sounded amazing.
Right? It sounds kind of great. So the James Bond ride had 2 distinct parts. There's the part where you wait in line and you get to a certain space and they sort of killing time before you go on the actual ride. But it's an original film, as you say, starring Judi Dench as M and Desmond Llewellyn as Q, where they tell the reader, the ride goer, the instructions of the ride, and they sort of set the scene and set Bond on his mission. And that was written by Bruce Fierstein, who, as everyone knows, wrote 3 Bond movies, or co-wrote 3 Bond movies. Mm-hmm. And then the ride itself, the conceit of the ride itself is that you are seeing the world through James Bond's eyes. So it's a point of view movie where you never see Bond. You might see his wrist or his arm or his hand as he outstretches for something, but you're seeing the whole movie is structured from his point of view, and it just there's explosions and mayhem.
It sounded incredible, and it is something that is surprising that didn't stick around, or kind of maybe they redo it. I mean, there's certain, obviously, thinking like the Jurassic Park ride, for example, kind of got its reboot with Jurassic World, and Bond does seem like a franchise that would suit a ride quite well, some sort of experience. So maybe we need to reboot it. Maybe again, Bond, whoever becomes the next Bond, and they can kind of bring all this back. I don't know.
That'd be great.
It would be. Two other things that I wanted to touch on that, again, loved learning about. Raymond Benson wrote a stage play treatment of Casino Royale, which, again, sounded amazing. Again, in discovering everything that you did with this, somebody as esteemed as Raymond Benson, who's obviously been heavily involved in the Bond franchise with some of his novels and sort of the books that he's written. I mean, is it surprising when you're discovering things like this that you think didn't take off or didn't kind of go ahead? Because it sounded very well crafted and like it was being very well put together.
Yeah, he says that that's really the only James. He correctly states that that's the only James Bond book or novel that could become a stage show, just because the novel is sort of self-contained. It's people in hotels, people playing cards, people fighting, and he had ideas on how to stage all of it, and it is a shame that didn't happen. But the other thing that I'm thinking about while you mentioned that is during the reading there was a actor who played James Bond. I think his name is Ed Clark. But so in the back of the book, I have a list. Like when you think of how many actors have played James Bond, what would you quickly say?
Well, I'd obviously say 6 straight away for the movies, but I love the number that you kind of came up with because it's very surprising.
Yeah, what is my number? Is it like 28?
It's over. It's something ridiculous like that, and because like the depth you go into it is like, obviously you've got your movies, your David Nivens, people like that.
I wish I remembered the number off the top of my head, but
I think you include like obviously like you've got your Oscar James Bond, and your TV commercial James Bond, things like that, which you kind of add to it.
Video game James Bond, James Bond.
It's fascinating. And speaking of radio James Bond, love the chat you have with Toby Stevens.
Oh my gosh!
As you can probably see behind me, Die Another Day. I'm a bit of a weird fanboy of it, so obviously love him as Gustav Graves. But again, a lot of people might not be aware that he plays James Bond in these radio plays and does a pretty good job with it. You mentioned there that it's something that he doesn't really talk about too often. So how tricky was it to kind of get Toby to open up about Bond?
That took a while. That was another one of those that took a while, and then that's another thing where I felt like I added value for Bond fans by giving them something that they couldn't get anywhere, which is, to my knowledge, the only in-depth interview with Toby Stevens about playing Bond in these many radio adaptations, which are fairly faithful, versions of Fleming's novels. And he's playing Fleming's Bond. And he also narrates the books. He also narrates a couple of Bond books. And what I think is kind of cool is that when he's narrating Fleming's books, it's one Bond, and his Bond on the radio dramas is a slightly different take on the character. But so it was. Long story short, I was thrilled to finally, get some information from him about that.
The one thing I'll say I was disappointed about it, Mark, was, again, there was no, and you might have asked him a question, it just didn't make the book, but there were no references to Die Another Day. I mean, I would have just been like, cool, you played Bond, but like, talk to me about Gustav, talk to me about Die Another Day, I'll be the guy that's defending you in it, Toby. You've probably gotten so much shit over the years, but I'll be the one, like, talk to me about Gustav.
Yeah, no, that's why you should, people who are not necessarily warm to that version of Gustav Graves should check out these radio dramas, because he's so good as James Bond.
Yeah, and it is kind of one of those fascinating things. I mean, I legitimately you're looking at all these lists now. Who will be the next James Bond now that Craig's gone? And Toby Stevens still appears on some of these. I think he's a bit old now, unfortunately, probably for the role. But I think some people think, well, he does such good in the radio one. Would we have a villain become James Bond essentially? One fascinating thing too, before we let you go, you've met, I believe, 4 out of the 6 actors who have played Bond on film. So if I'm not mistaken, it's only Connery and Dalton you haven't met.
That's correct.
Give us a brief rundown of how you've managed to have these experiences with 4 of the 6 movie Bonds.
I certainly don't want to overstate my connection to any of them. They were all brief and in passing. I met Roger Moore a few times at a few events that I only went to because I knew he would be there. I worked on a movie that Pierce Brosnan was at, so I was able to spend a little time with him. And so that was kind of neat. And who else is there? Lazenby I met for the interview. And I feel like there's one more.
Craig, I love your Craig story. I love this story.
I met Daniel. He was going to appear at a Q&A of Knives Out. And so I brought him my first Bond book and I presented it to him. And so that was like a little thrill for me because he was very gracious about it.
Which can I just point out, you got yourself a front row seat and you kind of rushed the stage, which I love that little bit which you said. I loved your line when you said he sort of graciously took it and how you would like to think that in the car back to the hotel where it was that he maybe had a bit of a flick through, which it's a nice little moment because I can imagine as an author when you're writing something like this and you get that opportunity to present someone a book like that you got to have that little moment of thinking like, well, maybe,
in my imaginings when he got into the car, he had this long ride, this New York City traffic. He has to get back to another borough perhaps, and he's got nothing else to do. Might as well read my book while he's in the car. And and the other thing I should briefly say is that the cover design is by Sean Longmore, who did these 2 brilliant covers, and the interior art is by Pat. And so this book is a team effort. I've had so many Bond fans. This is the thing sort of about Bond fans. I've had, I mentioned Brian and his help. There's another Bond fan named Jack Lugo who gave me tips and gave me and would read the book and said, move this over here, and he would give it wonderful advice. And so I think that the book is richer because of the Bond community, and it certainly wasn't a solo effort.
Well, one quick thing I just want to add just on the meeting of the Bonds. Obviously, sadly, Sean no longer with us, but is there kind of like a bucket list thing now that you've somehow got to meet Dalton? Like, is there just, if he's at an appearance, like just a quick, like, hey, how you going, Tim? Like, good on you. Like,
I would love to make that happen.
Yeah, we'll keep us updated. We'd love to learn. The book, of course, Lost Adventures of James Bond, Amazon, online, your website, markedlitz.com, of course, as well. Many Lives of James Bond available. Anywhere else people can check you out, Mark? Social media, anywhere else along those lines that people can maybe stay up to date with what you got coming up?
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. Twitter, there's Mark Edlitz on Twitter.
Just keep an eye on that. And you got any other plans for? Is there a third Bond book in the brain that you're thinking about potentially?
My next thing is not a Bond book, but I'm pretty far into my next book. Great. And then maybe there'll be something Bond after that. But that'll be a slow. That's not anytime soon.
That's not anytime soon. Do you want to tease what your book you're writing at the moment, or is that a bit of a secret you don't want to give too much away?
Not quite yet, but I think at the end of the year I'll be able to put it out.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely
keep
an eye.
It's about movie franchise. I could say generally it's about movie franchises and sequels in general.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So you perked my interest already with that one, definitely. As I said, Lost Adventures of James Bond. It's a fantastic book. People buy it. Seriously, you won't be able to put it down. Mark, really appreciate your time on 007 today. It's been an absolute thrill learning more about your book and everything else in between.
And big thanks for having me. Very grateful.